Have you ever seen a photograph that seemed to watch you back? A faded wedding portrait, a smiling young man with a ring that glints a little too brightly. For historian Rachel Foster, that image was the beginning of a discovery that would unravel one of the most powerful family legacies in America and expose a century of silence built upon poison and deceit. What began as quiet academic research soon drew the attention of a senator. A fortune and a buried crime, too carefully hidden to remain forgotten. Letters, diaries, and a ring designed not for love, but for death. Each piece whispered a truth the Clark family would do anything to keep buried. Tonight, we follow the trail Rachel uncovered from forgotten archives to courtroom threats, from arsenic-laced tonics to a single vial that survived the decades. A century-old photograph, a fortune built on murder, and a legacy that refused to stay silent. So settle in, and let's uncover the story of the poison ring, where history itself became the final witness. Would you like me to craft a Vietnamese version of this intro as well, keeping the same haunting tone for your channel narration? Dr. Rachel Foster sat hunched over her wooden desk in the forensic history department at Boston University. Before her lay a wedding photograph from 1913, a sepia-toned image that seemed to hum faintly with the weight of forgotten stories. A handsome couple stood frozen in time, the bride draped in a cascade of pearls over a delicate white gown, the groom tall beside her in mourning dress, his left hand raised just enough to make his wedding band the quiet center of attention. Another donation for the medical jewelry archive came Dr. Patel's voice from behind her shoulder. Rachel nodded. From the Reynolds family collection. But this one, something about it stopped me. The way he's displaying the ring, it's almost deliberate. For 3 years, Rachel had been building an archive of historical jewelry, once used for medical or pharmaceutical purposes. She placed the photograph beneath her digital microscope, adjusted the focus, and then froze. "James," she whispered, "look at this." Dr. Patel leaned closer, squinting. Then his brow furrowed. "That can't be right. That's a poison ring design. Italian 16th century. See the tiny hinge it's made to open to release powder." "Exactly," Rachel murmured. "But this photo's from 1913. Those designs weren't replicated until the Art Deco revival in the 1930s. This predates that by 20 years." She flipped the photograph over. The neat handwriting read Jonathan and Catherine Clark, N. Reynolds, June 14, 1913, Clark Pharmacy, Boston. A quick search told her that Jonathan Clark had been a prominent Boston pharmacist who'd married into the wealthy Reynolds textile family. But one note in the record chilled her. Catherine Clark. Deceased, December 1913, nervous fever. Only 6 months after the wedding. A pharmacist with access to every chemical imaginable. And a young wife dead of an unexplained illness. Academic curiosity began to blur into something more personal, darker, heavier. "I need to see if there are more photographs from this family," she said quietly, reaching for her phone. "And I want to find Catherine Clark's medical records." Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow. "Expanding your research, are you?" Rachel didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the groom's face in the photo. Handsome, confident, but with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Something's not right," she said softly. She had no way of knowing that the elegant ring had witnessed not one death, but five members of the Reynolds family. each one standing between Jonathan Clark and one of Boston's largest fortunes. Nor could she have imagined that her quiet investigation would unravel a crime buried for over a century, a thread leading directly into one of America's most powerful political bloodlines. The following morning, Rachel stood at the Massachusetts Medical Historical Society, poring over the archived records of Dr. William Hammond, the Reynolds family physician in the early 1900s. Catherine Clark's file was unusually long. Beginning in July 1913, just weeks after her wedding, she had begun experiencing a troubling pattern of symptoms: digestive distress, headaches, irritability, and growing weakness. By November, she was bedridden. Hammond's notes described nervous decline complicated by gastric disturbances, but the November entry stood out: patient's hair falling in patches, skin showing unusual pigmentation around fingernails and neck. Symptoms suggest possible arsenic exposure. Husband reports no chemicals of such kind in the household. The final line, dated December 18, 1913, read, Mrs. Catherine Clark succumbed to her illness at 3:17 a.m. Husband present. Death certificate issued citing nervous fever. Rachel exhaled slowly. Every detail, every symptom, they were all classic signs of chronic arsenic. Poisoning a toxin easily within reach of a pharmacist in 1913, when arsenic compounds were still common in medicine. But what began as academic intrigue turned unsettling as she delved deeper into the Reynolds family records. Catherine's father, industrialist George Reynolds, had died in March 1914, only 3 months after his daughter, with eerily similar symptoms. Her mother, Eleanor Reynolds, followed in July after a prolonged illness that mirrored her husband's. By September, Catherine's brother Thomas was dead from gastric inflammation with nervous complications. And by December, the final member of the family, her elderly Aunt Margaret, also succumbed to a sudden, unexplained sickness. In less than 18 months, the entire Reynolds family was gone, leaving Jonathan Clark, the newly married pharmacist, as the sole heir to a fortune worth $25 million in 1914 currency. Rachel silently photographed each record, her mind raising, her heart steady but heavy. The silence of the archive seemed to press in around her, as though the room itself were waiting for her to ask the question forming in her chest. Was that ring merely a relic of a bygone age, or the weapon that began one of the quietest killing sprees in Boston's history? The symptoms across all 5 deaths were unmistakable, each one consistent with arsenic poisoning. The timing drew a near-perfect pattern each passing month, tightening a noose of quiet inheritance, until Jonathan Clark stood alone, the sole master of the entire Reynolds fortune. And that wedding ring, designed to conceal and dispense fine powder, it might not have been a symbol of love at all, but a weapon delicately disguised. A pharmacist like Jonathan would have known exactly how to measure, how to mask the taste, how to make death unfold like a natural illness. The thought lingered in Rachel's mind as she packed her notes. Before leaving, her phone buzzed with a new message, an email from the executor of the Reynolds estate. Additional family materials discovered in a sealed trunk in the attic. Diaries, correspondence, and financial records, 1910 and 1920. The address at the end of the message made Rachel pause the old Reynolds mansion on Beacon Hill. That evening, under the fading light, Rachel climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, guided by the estate executor, Richard Blackwell. The air was thick with dust and history. Cardboard boxes and steamer trunks lined the walls. Their labels faded into sepia ghosts. "These materials haven't been examined in decades," Blackwell said softly, resting his hand on a heavy leather trunk. "Your timing, Dr. Foster, is rather extraordinary." Rachel knelt and carefully opened the trunk. Inside lay stacks of documents, ledgers, letters, photographs, and nestled between them a small diary with Eleanor Reynolds embossed on its worn leather cover. A key had been taped discreetly to the inside of the lid. When she turned it in the lock, the old pages released a faint scent of lavender and age. The early entries radiated warmth, a mother's pride at her daughter's engagement to the charming young pharmacist, Jonathan Clark. But by mid-August, the tone shifted. August 12th, 1913. "Catherine visited today. She looks pale and unsettled. She says she has felt unwell since returning from their honeymoon. Jonathan insists it is only the strain of adjustment and prescribes her tonics of his own making. I am troubled by the yellowing of her skin and the tremor in her hands." Rachel read slowly, her pulse steady, but her chest tight. Each line drew her deeper into a mother's silent dread. Then came November 18th, 1913. "I can no longer ignore my fears. Catherine's illness mirrors the arsenic poisoning cases described in Dr. Hamilton's medical text. I have seen Jonathan give her the medicine himself. Today I noticed a peculiar ring on his hand, a ring with what looked to be a small compartment. When I asked, he quickly covered it and changed the subject." Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she turned the page. The final entries were almost unbearable to read. December 19th, 1913. "My beloved Catherine was buried today. Jonathan played the grieving husband perfectly, yet I saw no true sorrow in his eyes. George now believes there may be truth in my suspicions, but warns we must proceed with caution." January the 10th, 1914. "George has fallen ill. His symptoms mirror Catherine's first decline. Jonathan has offered his own medications, which George wisely refused. We have replaced the household staff as a precaution. Still, his weakness grows worse by the day." The entries stopped abruptly in February 1914. But tucked beneath the diary was a single unsent letter, its edges browned with age. It was addressed to George Reynolds' attorney. "Should anything happen to me, I must place on record my grave suspicions concerning my son-in-law, Jonathan Clark. Eleanor and I believe he is responsible for Catherine's death through deliberate poisoning, likely arsenic. We have seen him using a ring fitted with a hidden compartment to introduce powders into food or drink. George Reynolds had died before the letter was ever sent. His amended will never executed." The legal records that followed told the rest of the story, Jonathan Clark quietly assuming control of the Reynolds fortune throughout 1914, piece by piece. As Rachel gathered her files, Blackwell mentioned something almost casually, a name that made her pause mid-step. "The current owner of Clark Pharmaceuticals is coming by tomorrow," he said. "Senator Harold Clark. Jonathan Clark's great-grandson and as of this week a presidential candidate." The next morning, Rachel's research led her to the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy, whose archives held the original business ledgers of Clark Pharmacy, dating from 1910 to 1920. "Clark's was quite prominent," explained Dr. Martin Chen, the archivist, as he guided her to a quiet reading room. Jonathan Clark was known for his specialty compounds and for importing innovative European preparations. After 1914, his business expanded rapidly, eventually evolving into what we now know as Clark Pharmaceuticals. The purchasing records confirmed what Rachel had begun to fear. Between January 1913 and December 1914, Clark Pharmacy had ordered extraordinary amounts of arsenic compounds officially for medicinal use. But the prescription ledger was the true revelation. Starting in June 1913, Jonathan Clark had begun compounding personalized tonics for each member of the Reynolds family. Each name was written carefully in Jonathan's own neat script. Mrs. Catherine Clark, Digestive Tonic. Mr. George Reynolds, Vitality Preparation. Mrs. Eleanor Reynolds, Nerve Restorative. Thomas Reynolds, Gastric Elixir. Margaret Reynolds, Evening Tonic. Rachel stared at the list. The ink faded but legible. Each mixture, each bottle, each patient, another thread in the quiet tapestry of death that had bound an entire family to a single man and to a single ring. She leaned back in her chair, the hum of the archive filling the silence. How many secrets, she wondered, had been buried beneath the polish of Boston's golden age? And how much of that darkness still pulsed quietly, generation after generation under a new name, Clark Pharmaceuticals. The symptoms described across all 5 deaths matched arsenic poisoning with chilling consistency. The timing formed a pattern so neat, it looked deliberate. A slow, methodical clearing of obstacles until Jonathan Clark stood alone, the inheritor of the Reynolds fortune. And that ring in the wedding photograph, a device made to hide and dispense powder, offered a plausible method. A pharmacist would understand exactly how to turn arsenic into something that read like ordinary illness. Before she left the archives that day, an email arrived from the Reynolds estate. A sealed trunk in the attic had been opened, and inside were diaries, correspondence and financial records spanning 1910 to 1920. The address sent Rachel to a shadowed Beacon Hill mansion, its attic thick with dust and the weight of untold pages. Inside the trunk, she found more than ledgers. There was a locked diary stamped Eleanor Reynolds and a tiny key taped to the underside of the lid. When she opened it, the voice of a mother unfurled across brittle paper. First gentle pride at her daughter's engagement, then a slow descent into alarm. By August, the entries had already grown anxious. August 12, 1913. Catherine visited today. She looks pale and troubled. She says she has felt unwell since the honeymoon. Jonathan insists it is merely adjustment and prescribes tonics from his pharmacy. I am worried by the yellowing of her skin and the tremor in her hands. By November, the tone had tightened into accusation. November 18, 1913. I can no longer ignore my darkest fears. Catherine's symptoms mirror those described for arsenic poisoning in Dr. Hamilton's book. I have seen Jonathan give her medicine himself. Today, I noticed a curious ring on his hand, a compartment perhaps. When I asked, he covered it and changed the subject. The final entries broke the heart. Catherine's funeral, the perfunctory grief of a husband who played his part well, and then George Reynolds' own illness in January. Eleanor's writing ends in February 1914. Beneath the diary lay an unsent letter. George had intended for his attorney a last testament of suspicion. Should anything happen to me, I must record my grave concerns about my son-in-law, Jonathan Clark. Eleanor and I believe he administered poison, likely arsenic, using a ring fitted with a hidden compartment to introduce powders into food or drink. George Reynolds died before the letter was mailed. His attempted will changes were never enacted. Legal filings and estate inventories from 1914 show Jonathan Clark assuming control of Reynolds' assets with unnerving ease. Then, almost casually, the estate's executor dropped a modern name into the conversation. The current owner of Clark Pharmaceuticals would be visiting tomorrow. Senator Harold Clark, Jonathan's great-grandson, and now a presidential candidate. The past and the present sat beside each other in that attic, the pages whispering across a century. Rachel followed the paper trail to the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy archives, where the Clark Pharmacy ledgers from 1910 to 1920 had been preserved. The archivist, Dr. Martin Chen, explained that personalized preparations were common practice then. Rachel asked, were ingredients usually recorded? Usually yes, Dr. Chen said, for inventory and safety. Yet, the Reynolds entries were different. There were no ingredient lists, only neat notations. Formulas personally compounded by J. Clark, kept in private formulary. The formulary itself was nowhere to be found. What she did find were employment records naming a young assistant, Michael Sullivan, who worked for Clark from 1912 to 1915 and then relocated to Chicago. Sullivan became a thread leading across state lines. In Chicago public records, Rachel discovered a sworn statement Sullivan had given to a private investigator in 1919, a statement preserved in the Chicago History Museum. It was damning. I observed Mr. Clark creating unlabeled preparations using arsenic compounds. These were kept separate and administered personally to his wife's family. Most disturbing was the special ring Mr. Clark often wore, a reproduction of an antique design with a hidden compartment. I observed him using it to extract powder, which he added to the Reynolds family preparations. The investigation stalled when Sullivan died unexpectedly in early 1920, his death recorded as pneumonia. With their key witness gone, any prosecutorial momentum evaporated. Wealth and influence, it seemed, had a way of sealing loose ends. Rachel's phone lit up with a news alert, Senator Harold Clark leading in the polls. The photograph attached showed a man with Jonathan Clark's jaw, the same practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The implications of Rachel's archival digging crystallized with a new modern weight. Using Reynolds' money, Jonathan had expanded a single pharmacy into Clark Pharmaceuticals by 1920. The company flourished government contracts in 2 world wars, political inroads, the family's slow rise from merchants to power brokers. Jonathan lived into the 1960s. His descendants entered politics. By the time Harold Clark ran for president, the family story in public eyes was one of business success and civic service, a narrative that, if what Rachel had found was true, had been built atop arsenic and quiet deaths. She reasoned carefully. As a historian, she had an obligation to pursue truth, yet she also understood the detonative potential of her findings. Accusing a presidential candidate of benefiting from a murderous ancestor would invite scrutiny, resistance, and perhaps danger. She brought her research to her department chair, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, initially, without mentioning Senator Clark. Dr. Morgan read the files and said quietly, "This is extraordinary. A clear case of serial poisoning. using a pharmacist's knowledge and an ingenious delivery method. Rachel added the modern complication. The murderer's descendant is a prominent public figure. How prominent? Dr. Morgan asked. Presidential candidate Rachel said. Silence hung in the office. This creates significant ethical considerations, Dr. Morgan said at last. Historical truth matters, but so does how it's used. Make your research bulletproof before you go public. And Rachel, powerful people protect themselves. Watch your step. That evening, Rachel made encrypted backups of her files, scattering copies across secure locations. As she worked, an email from Richard Blackwell arrived. Senator Clark had expressed interest in her research and specifically asked about the wedding photograph. He had requested a meeting at the Reynolds estate the following day. Rachel stared at the message. She had told Blackwell only that she was researching early 20th century medical jewelry. She had not mentioned arsenic, the deaths, or Jonathan Clark's ring. How she wondered, did the senator know the precise focus of her work? Her caution proved wise. The next morning, she found her office had been searched overnight. Nothing major was missing, but papers were slightly moved. Drawers, not fully shut, small telling signs, an archivist notices immediately. Campus security claimed a routine maintenance check. But Rachel's instincts, honed on the brittle edges of old documents, told her otherwise. Who had been in her office? And how closely were the past and present watching each other now? The security footage from Rachel's building showed nothing, at least not during the crucial hours of the night. Every camera had suffered a technical malfunction, conveniently aligned with the time her office had been searched. This isn't coincidence, Rachel told Dr. Patel the next morning, her voice tight with certainty. Someone wanted to see my research. Without leaving a trace, Dr. Patel frowned. You think it's connected to the Clark matter? Rachel's answer was immediate. What else could it be? I've documented evidence that the Clark family fortune began with 5 murders. That's not the kind of origin story a presidential candidate wants circulating. Before Dr. Patel could respond, Rachel's phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Your research on historical pharmaceuticals sounds fascinating. Perhaps we could discuss it over coffee. I have information that might interest you. Michael Clark, Pharmaceuticals Research Division. Rachel stared at the screen. Another Clark, another sudden interest in her work. The coincidence stretched beyond reason. She showed the message to Dr. Patel, who studied it gravely. They're closing ranks, he said. The question is, are they just trying to contain political damage from a historical scandal, or is there something deeper, something more dangerous? Rachel hesitated. Like what? The Clark fortune is worth billions, Dr. Patel said quietly. Their company holds government contracts, international partnerships, and enough influence to crush a problem before it becomes public. Even a rumor of ancestral murder could send stock prices tumbling and invite regulatory investigations. If they think you could trigger that, Rachel understood. Whether she responded or ignored them, she was already a variable in a powerful equation. After careful thought, she typed her reply, I'd be happy to discuss historical pharmaceutical practices. Perhaps the university coffee shop tomorrow at 10 a.m. The response came within seconds. Perfect. I have particular interest in historical pharmaceutical dispensers, including jewelry. See you tomorrow. That last word, jewelry, made her pulse quicken. There was no way he could have known that detail unless someone had been reading her notes. That night, Rachel worked methodically. She compiled a complete timeline of her findings. The deaths, the formulas, the letters, the ring, the assistant's testimony. She scanned everything, uploaded copies to secure cloud storage, and emailed a sealed backup to her attorney with simple instructions. If I don't check in every 24 hours, release everything to the journalists and scholars listed below. Before bed, she pulled up the old wedding photograph once more. For the first time, Catherine Reynolds's expression looked different to her, not solemn but uncertain. As if she had sensed, even on that bright afternoon, the danger standing beside her. Rachel touched the glass gently. "I'll make sure they know what he did to you," she whispered. "To all of you." The next morning, sunlight slanted through the university coffee shop's high windows. It was the perfect setting, open enough for witnesses, quiet enough for a private exchange. Rachel arrived early, choosing a corner table where she could see every entrance. At exactly 10 o'clock, a tall man entered mid-40s, confident, impeccably dressed. He had the unmistakable Clark features, the composed expression, the smooth, rehearsed charm. Dr. Foster, he greeted, extending his hand. "Michael Clark. Thank you for meeting me." His grip was firm, his smile practiced. "I've been following your work on historical pharmaceutical devices," he continued. "Fascinating material. I wasn't aware my research had reached beyond academic circles," Rachel said lightly, though her gaze stayed sharp. "The Clark family has always maintained a deep interest in pharmaceutical history," he replied. "I understand you've been studying a particular wedding photograph from 1913 featuring my great-grandfather." No pretense. Rachel almost respected that. "Yes," she said evenly. "Your great-grandfather's ring caught my attention. It appears to be a reproduction of a 16th century Italian poison ring, a style that wasn't commonly replicated until decades later." Michael's expression remained calm. Jonathan Clark was fascinated by antique dispensers. Family stories say he collected them rings, lockets, even cane handles designed to carry medicines. They were curiosities of the trade, or Rachel said softly, tools for systematic poisoning. Something flickered in his eyes, just for a moment, before he regained control. "Historical devices had multiple purposes," he said carefully. "So did your great-grandfather," Rachel replied. "I have evidence medical records describing arsenic poisoning in 5 members of the Reynolds family. Eleanor Reynolds's diary, documenting her suspicions. A letter from George Reynolds accusing Jonathan Clark directly. Pharmacy records showing his access to arsenic. And sworn testimony from his assistant Michael Sullivan describing the ring your great-grandfather used to administer poison." Michael's composure cracked slightly, the veneer thinning. "Dr. Foster, historical documents can be misleading. Medical knowledge was primitive in 1913. Those deaths could have been illness infection. 5 healthy people," Rachel interrupted, "dying in the same pattern within 18 months, all showing identical symptoms of arsenic poisoning. And every one of them connected to your great-grandfather's financial gain." Michael fell silent. Around them, the soft hum of the cafe filled the space, a quiet, civilized setting where the ghosts of the past seemed to press close, listening. Rachel leaned forward just enough for him to see the steadiness in her eyes. History doesn't forget, she said quietly. It just waits for someone to open the right box. That wasn't standard practice in any era, Rachel said softly. Michael leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. What exactly are you planning to do with this research, Dr. Foster? Publish it, she replied without hesitation. Historical truth matters. His expression tightened. You understand the implications for my family, for my uncle's campaign for a company that employs thousands of people. I understand, Rachel said evenly, that your family's wealth and influence began with murder. How that affects your present circumstances isn't my primary concern as a historian. A flicker of something cold passed across his face, then vanished beneath the smooth professionalism of his smile. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, sliding it across the table. The Clark Foundation is establishing a new historical research endowment, he said evenly. We'd be very interested in funding your work, provided your focus broadened beyond our family, of course. Rachel looked at the card, then at him. She didn't need to ask what kind of offer this was. I don't think our research interests align, Mr. Clark. He gave a small, disappointed sigh. That's unfortunate. As he stood to leave, he hesitated, his tone turning almost casual. One last thing. We'd like to acquire the wedding photograph you've been studying for our family archive. Name your price. Rachel's voice stayed calm. It's not for sale. It's historical evidence. Michael's eyes hardened just slightly, but enough to chill the air between them. Evidence requires context, Dr. Foster, he said. And context can change dramatically depending on who provides it. Consider your position carefully. Historical researchers should avoid becoming part of the history they study. The threat was soft, elegant, and unmistakable. As he walked away, Rachel sat still, her pulse steady but cold. The Clarks knew exactly what she had uncovered. They'd tried to buy her silence first. Now they were hinting at something darker. That evening, as twilight fell over Boston, her phone rang. It was Richard Blackwell from the Reynolds estate. Dr. Foster. He began carefully. Senator Clark has formally requested the return of all materials related to his great-grandparents. He's asserting a claim of family heritage. That includes the wedding photograph you've been examining. On what legal grounds? Rachel asked, though she already suspected the answer. There appears to be a complication, Blackwell said. The donation paperwork transferring the materials to the university's archives was never fully executed. A clerical oversight. Technically, the estate still retains ownership until proper transfer is completed. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. A convenient oversight, she murmured. The senator has requested a meeting tomorrow morning with the university's legal department. Blackwell continued to discuss the appropriate handling of potentially sensitive historical materials. His attorneys will be present. When the call ended, Rachel immediately contacted Dr. Morgan. They're escalating, Dr. Morgan said grimly after hearing the story. That suggests your research has them genuinely worried. What's the university likely to do? Rachel asked. Officially, they'll support academic freedom, Dr. Morgan said. Unofficially, they'll be cautious. The Clark family donates heavily. And if there's any question about the ownership of those materials, the administration will want to tread very carefully. After the call, Rachel acted quickly. She sent her complete research archive, every document, every scanned page, to 3 trusted colleagues at different universities. She reached out to a journalist friend at the Boston Globe, offering a vague outline of her findings without naming the clerks. And she secured the physical evidence, the diaries, the letters, and most importantly, the wedding photograph in a private safe deposit box accessible only to her. By morning, she was ready. When Rachel arrived at the university's administration building, the atmosphere felt charged like a courtroom before the verdict. Senator Harold Clark was already there, tall, silver-haired, and perfectly composed. 3 attorneys flanked him. Blackwell sat nearby, looking uncomfortable. At the far end of the table, Dr. Morgan gave Rachel a small, steady nod. Dr. Foster, the senator, said smoothly, standing to greet her, "Thank you for joining us. I understand you've been researching my family history. I've been researching a historical case of serial poisoning that happens to involve your great-grandfather," Rachel said evenly, taking her seat. The senator's smile flickered, polite, restrained. A rather serious characterization of what I understand to be ambiguous historical records. One of his attorneys leaned forward. "We've reviewed the materials, Dr. Foster. Your conclusions are circumstantial at best. Medical knowledge in 1913 was limited. Many of those symptoms could be attributed to other causes." Rachel kept her voice calm. "This isn't speculative interpretation," she said. "I have multiple independent lines of evidence. Medical records, eyewitness testimony, personal correspondence, all pointing to deliberate arsenic poisoning. The only reason justice wasn't served was because the victims died before they could act." The room fell quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the senator's attorneys seemed uncertain how to proceed. Rachel could feel the weight of history pressing down on that table. Old sins, old power, old ghosts. And for the first time, she realized how far the Clarks were willing to go to protect the story they'd built their empire upon. The university council sat in uneasy silence. Papers shuffled. Eyes avoided one another. The question at hand was deceptively simple. Who owned the research materials? More specifically, who owned the photograph that had reignited a century-old tragedy? If the donation wasn't properly executed, Rachel began, her voice calm but steady, then the photograph is only secondary evidence. What matters now is the truth it reveals. She laid her notes upon the table, months of meticulous documentation, cross-referenced and authenticated. The original's ownership, she continued, does not alter the facts of history. Her words hung in the air, thin and electric. Tension was already building beyond those walls. The Clark family had begun to move against her. Sensing time slipping away, Rachel pressed forward. She gathered her 3 most trusted colleagues, all of whom had independently verified her findings, and began assembling a paper that would challenge the foundations of one of America's most powerful families. The manuscript was a careful, devastating reconstruction of Jonathan Clark's systematic poisoning of the Reynolds family in 1913 and 1914. The medical records revealed the telltale signs of arsenic in every victim. Eleanora Reynolds' diary chronicled her growing suspicion and her fear. A final unsent letter from George Reynolds accused his own son-in-law of murder. Pharmacy ledgers proved Clark's access to arsenic, and a sworn statement from a young assistant, Michael Sullivan, described a strange ring, one designed not for ornament but for death, When the paper reached Dr. Keller, a forensic historian at Princeton, he read it in silence. Then quietly he said, "This is extraordinary work. The convergence of evidence, it's beyond reasonable doubt." Rachel submitted her findings to the Journal of American Medical History. The response came within hours. Dr. Helen Martinez, the editor-in-chief, wrote, "This may be groundbreaking, but given the sensitivity of the Clark name, your work will undergo exceptional review. 6 independent historians will test every conclusion." As the academic wheels turned, the Clark family struck back. Their attorneys sent formal letters, threats disguised as warnings. Senator Clark, then in the midst of his presidential campaign, announced a grand donation to Boston University, funding a new medical research center. It was a move too transparent to ignore an attempt to buy silence. Rachel's department chair, Dr. Morgan, called her in. "The university won't block your paper," he said softly, "but they'll keep their distance. If the Clarks come after you legally, you'll stand alone." "I expected as much," Rachel replied. "The evidence will speak for itself." That evening, as the city settled into dusk, a visitor arrived at her apartment, Elizabeth Reynolds, great-grandniece of Catherine Reynolds. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a small box upon the table. "The women in my family have kept this for generations," she said. Inside, wrapped in aged linen, was a glass vial, labeled in faded ink, "Catherine's medicine, do not discard." "My ancestor Eleanora Reynolds saved this," Elizabeth whispered. "She suspected what Jonathan Clark was doing. Do you think it could still be tested for arsenic?" Rachel examined the vial carefully, light glinting off the sealed glass. "It's possible," she said. "If this contains what I think it does, it might be the final piece." With Elizabeth's permission, she sent it for toxicological analysis, not through the university, but through an independent lab, safely beyond Clark influence. 3 days later, the results came in. At the very same moment, all 6 peer reviewers confirmed her conclusions. The tonic contained high concentrations of arsenic, far beyond any medicinal standard of its era. Rachel added the findings to her paper. The publication date was set. The truth was no longer buried, it was alive and unstoppable. That night, the phone rang. An unlisted number. A familiar cold voice. "Dr. Foster," said Senator Clark, "I'm offering you one final opportunity to reconsider your publication. Name your terms." "I don't have terms," Senator Rachel answered quietly. "I have evidence. History deserves the truth." A pause. Then his reply, low and deliberate. "History is written by survivors, Dr. Foster. My great-grandfather understood that. Consider which history you'd prefer to belong to." When the call ended, Rachel sat motionless for a moment, then began sending encrypted copies of her data to secure archives. Whatever happened next, the truth would endure. A week later, the paper was published, "The Poison Ring Serial Murder and the Origins of the Clark Pharmaceutical Fortune." The reaction was immediate. Headlines spread across the country. The world learned how Jonathan Clark had poisoned 5 members of the Reynolds family, using a custom ring to deliver arsenic, then inherited their wealth to build his empire. The Clarks fought back with fury. Defamation suits were filed. Senator Clark denounced Rachel publicly, accusing her of character assassination disguised as scholarship. He suspended his campaign to fight this historical lie. But the evidence was unshakable. When the toxicology results became public proving lethal arsenic in Catherine Reynolds' preserved medicine, the tide began to turn. And then came a discovery no one expected. The Chicago Historical Society uncovered forgotten papers written by Michael Sullivan himself, the pharmacy assistant who had testified against Clark. Before his death in 1920, he had recorded every detail of the poisonings, entrusting the documents to his lawyer with one instruction: release them when justice becomes possible. Now at last, justice was possible. The new documents combined with Rachel's research silenced all doubt. Major newspapers ran exposés on the Clark Empire's bloody foundations. Documentaries followed. Senator Clark's political career collapsed under the weight of his own family's past. The lawsuits evaporated. Clark Pharmaceutical stock crashed. Family members were forced out. For the first time in a century, truth eclipsed power. 6 months later, Rachel Foster stood on stage to accept the Bancroft Prize for Historical Scholarship. She didn't speak of the Clarks. She spoke of the Reynolds family. Justice came a century too late, she said softly. But it came. And that reminds us truth matters not just for the past, but for the living. No wealth, no power should exist beyond accountability. The photograph that began it all now rests in the Smithsonian, a solemn artifact of beauty and horror. Visitors pause before the image, a young pharmacist smiling faintly, his wedding ring glinting, the very ring that once dispensed death. Beside it, a placard displays Eleanor Reynolds' final words. Truth may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. I may not live to see justice, but one day someone will. A century later, her faith was rewarded. The poison ring had kept its secret for generations. But in the end, even silence left behind traces. And those traces once found spoke loudly enough to echo through time.